The Illusion of Investing by Wealthy Mindset Audiobooks. Most people who are not building wealth are not failing at investing. They are succeeding with genuine effort and real intention at the appearance of it. The account exists, the knowledge is present, and yet something in the outcome quietly refuses to match the expectation. The problem, it turns out, is not the market, not the timing, and not the product. It is a misunderstanding so fundamental and so widely shared that it has been mistaken for wisdom. This audiobook does not offer a new strategy. It offers something more useful: the clarity to finally see the difference between owning an investment and actually building one, and the understanding of why that difference, invisible on the surface, changes everything beneath it. There is a particular kind of disappointment that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with the sharp clarity of a mistake you can point to, examine, and correct. It settles in slowly, the way a room cools after the heat has been off for hours, until one day you notice the temperature has dropped and you can't quite remember when it changed. That is the disappointment many people carry about their financial lives. Not a crisis, not a catastrophe, just a quiet, persistent gap between where they are and where they were certain they would be by now. You did what you were supposed to do. That part is important to acknowledge, because the frustration you feel is not the frustration of someone who ignored the advice. You listened, you acted. At some point, maybe years ago, maybe more recently, you made the decision that most people only talk about making. You opened the account. You made the first deposit. You crossed the threshold that separates intention from action. And in that moment, something in you relaxed. The future had been addressed. The machinery you believed was now in motion. And yet, here you are. The account exists. The statements arrive. But when you look at the numbers honestly, not the numbers relative to last month, but the numbers relative to the version of yourself you imagined when you started, something doesn't add up. The growth that was supposed to feel undeniable by now feels at best modest. At worst, it feels like you've been treading water in a pool you were told was a river. The frustration this produces is not loud. That's what makes it so difficult to address. Loud frustration has direction. It points at something, demands a response, creates enough energy to prompt change. But this frustration is quieter than that. It is a low, persistent hum, a background sense that something is working against you, even though you can't identify what, and can't fully explain why you feel it every time you open that app and stare at a number that doesn't seem to move the way you were told it would. So you look outward for explanations, as most of us do. The market has been volatile. The timing was off. You started during the wrong cycle. Interest rates did something unexpected. The economy is complicated, and some of those things may even be partially true. But underneath the reasonable explanations, there is a more uncomfortable possibility that you haven't yet looked at directly, not because you are avoiding it deliberately, but because it requires a kind of honesty that most financial conversations never ask for. Consider the contradiction for a moment. You are more financially literate than most people you know. You understand, at least in general terms, how compounding works. You know that investing early matters, that markets recover, that time in the market tends to outperform timing the market. You have absorbed the vocabulary, read the articles, perhaps even followed the debates about index funds versus active management, about asset allocation, about risk tolerance. By most measures, you are informed, and yet your net worth tells a story that doesn't match your level of awareness. That gap between what you know And what your financial life actually reflects is not a gap that more information will close. It is a different kind of gap entirely, and it points at something that financial literacy, on its own, was never designed to address. There is a line from the investor Howard Marks that stays with me. The most important thing is how you respond to what happens, not what happens. It seems straightforward the first time you read it, but sit with it long enough and it begins to ask something harder, not about your knowledge of markets, but about your knowledge of yourself inside them. Because here is what most financial conversations quietly skip over. The account was never the answer. It was only ever the room. A room that was set up carefully, arranged thoughtfully, and then left. Not abandoned, but not truly inhabited either. The account holds the potential for something, but potential is not a process. A room does not furnish itself simply because the door was opened. And wealth, it turns out, does not build itself simply because the account was opened. This is not a criticism. It is a clarification. And the reason it matters, the reason it is worth sitting with rather than moving past, is that as long as the account is confused for the investing, the real work remains unstarted. Not because you lack the resources or the intent, but because the map you've been using has been slightly, consequentially wrong about where the journey actually begins. The question worth carrying into what follows is not whether you have done something, you have. The question is whether what you have done is the same thing as what you believe you have done. And quietly, if you're honest, you may already sense that it isn't. The belief itself is not the problem. That's the first thing worth understanding, because if you walk away from this section thinking you simply believed something foolish, you will have missed the more important point entirely. The belief that opened your investment account, the belief that time and markets and compound growth work together to build wealth, is correct. It is not a myth. It is not a sales pitch dressed up as wisdom. The mathematics are real, the evidence is substantial, and the principle behind it has held across more economic cycles than any of us will live to see. The belief was never wrong, but a belief can be true and still be incomplete. And incompleteness, held with confidence, is one of the most expensive conditions a person can carry, because it feels exactly like understanding. It produces the calm of someone who has figured something out, while quietly leaving the most consequential part of the equation unexamined. This is the misdiagnosis that costs people not months, but decades, not because they believed something false, but because they believed something partial and experienced the partial belief as the whole truth. The common version of the story goes like this. You open the account, you make a deposit, you let time do its work, and wealth follows. Each part of that sentence is true in isolation. Time does work. Compound growth is real. Accounts are necessary. But notice what sits invisibly between each of those steps, the part the sentence skips over entirely. Consistent, continued, repeated contribution. The return. The unglamorous, unremarkable act of coming back to the process when nothing about the moment feels particularly motivated or inspired or financially optimal. That part never made it into the simple version of the story, and its absence has been quietly catastrophic for millions of people who followed the instructions they were given and still arrived somewhere disappointing. There is a reason the gym membership analogy has endured so long in conversations about habit and intention. Not because it's clever, but because it is precise. Consider what happens when someone signs up for a membership with full sincerity. The research, the comparison, the careful choice, the first visit, the genuine feeling of possibility. All of that is real. The contract is real. The desire is real. The equipment is there. The structure exists. But the adaptation, the actual physiological change that only occurs through consistent stress and recovery over weeks and months of return, that only begins when the person keeps coming back. And the membership, however faithfully maintained as a financial obligation, never produces fitness on its own. The structure was present. The practice never fully started. This is not a metaphor about motivation. It is a metaphor about what the structure can and cannot do on your behalf. The account, like the membership, is infrastructure. Infrastructure enables a process. It does not replace one. And the moment the mind treats the infrastructure as the outcome, the moment the account's existence gets filed internally under handle, the behavior that would have justified that confidence quietly stalls. Not because the person became lazy or irresponsible, but because the psychological work of deciding was complete, and completion, even premature completion, produces a very convincing sense of rest. The hidden cost of this particular misdiagnosis is not a line item on a statement. You will not find it labeled anywhere. It shows up instead as the absence of growth that should have been there. The compound returns across 11 years that had no consistent material to work with because the contributions were irregular, the re-entries were delayed, and the quiet months were treated as acceptable pauses in a process that actually required continuity. Absence is harder to grieve than loss. Loss has a number. Absence is just the space where a number would have been. Here is the recognition that this section is quietly asking for. Most people who are not building wealth the way they expected are not failing at investing. They are succeeding with some consistency and genuine effort at the appearance of investing. The account is real. The intention is real. The awareness is real. But the practice, the repeated, unconditional, unsexy return, has been inconsistent enough that the engine has never been allowed to run at the speed it was designed for. As the writer Morgan Housel observed, your personal experiences with money make up maybe 0.000000001% of what's happened in the world, but maybe 80% of how you think it works. The experience of opening an account and making a deposit feels like investing. It looks like investing. To everyone around you, it is investing. And that experience, that feeling of completion, has been shaping how you think the whole process works, even when the results have been quietly telling a different story. The problem then is not the market. It is not the timing. It is not even the account. The problem is that the diagnosis stopped one layer too early. And until the real layer is examined, every solution applied above it will keep producing the same insufficient result. The problem was never what you thought it was. And that sentence is worth slowing down on because it is not an accusation. It is a clarification. Everything examined so far has been circling a center that is behavioral rather than financial. Not a market problem, not a product problem, not even a knowledge problem, because you have already established that knowledge was present. The root of what has been quietly limiting your financial life is something older and more personal than any of those things. It is a pattern of behavior so normalized, so widely shared, and so effectively disguised that most people carry it for decades without ever giving it a name. The pattern begins with a confusion that sounds almost too simple to be consequential. It is the confusion between owning a vehicle and actually traveling, between having the means and using the means consistently, repeatedly, regardless of whether conditions feel favorable or the destination feels real on any particular day. The investment account is the vehicle. It was built well. It was chosen carefully. It sits in the driveway, fully functional, fueled, and ready. But travel only happens when you get in and drive. And driving, not once, not occasionally, but as a sustained and unconditional practice, is the part of the equation that has been quietly missing. What makes this pattern so difficult to detect is how it accumulates. It does not announce itself as failure. It doesn't show up as a single bad decision you can isolate and learn from. It compounds in the wrong direction through absence. The contribution that wasn't made in October because the headlines were alarming. The position sold in March because fear briefly felt indistinguishable from wisdom. The account that has been sitting at roughly the same number for 2 years. Not because anything went wrong, but because the inputs were too irregular for the process to gain real momentum. Absence is invisible on a statement, but its effect over a decade is as real and as measurable as any market loss. Here is where the story becomes uncomfortable in a specific way. Intelligence does not protect against this pattern. In fact, and this is the contradiction worth sitting with, intelligence often deepens it. The more capable a person is of constructing a rational argument, the more convincing their reasons become for pausing, for waiting until things are clearer, for reconsidering the allocation, reviewing the strategy, holding off until the uncertainty resolves itself, which it never fully does, because uncertainty is not a temporary condition of markets. It is a permanent one, and the intelligent investor, armed with analysis and awareness, finds no shortage of legitimate-sounding reasons to remain on the edge of the process rather than fully inside it. This produces one of the quietest ironies in personal finance. The behaviors that feel most like responsibility, monitoring the portfolio closely, staying informed about conditions, responding thoughtfully to changing circumstances, are often the precise behaviors that interrupt compounding at its most critical stages. Attentiveness, in this context, becomes a liability disguised as virtue. The investor who checks in frequently, adjusts regularly, and responds to conditions diligently is not building with more precision than the investor who contributes consistently and looks less often. In most cases, they are building considerably less while experiencing considerably more effort and stress in the process. The pattern wears its disguise well. It presents as engagement. It feels like prudence. It has the texture of someone who is serious about their financial life, who doesn't just set things and forget them, who stays involved. But underneath the presentation, stripped of its justifications, it is a sophisticated and well-rationalized form of inconsistency. And inconsistency, not volatility, not inflation, not poor fund selection, is the primary reason most investment accounts grow far more slowly than the mathematics of compounding would otherwise allow. Perhaps the moment of recognition in this section is a quiet one. Think back over the last 2 or 3 years of your financial life. Have you ever paused a contribution during a downturn, telling yourself you'd restart when things stabilized? Have you ever sold a position when fear became louder than your original reasoning, and then found that re-entering felt expensive or awkward by the time confidence returned? Have you ever checked your portfolio more times in a single week than you added to it in a single year. If any of those questions land with even a small weight of recognition, that is the pattern, not a personal failure, not a reflection of insufficient commitment. It is a behavioral tendency so common, so deeply wired into how humans respond to uncertainty, that it operates across income levels, education levels, and decades of market experience. As James Clear writes, "You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems." The pattern described here is not a goal problem. The goals were always present. It is a systems problem, specifically, the absence of a behavioral structure strong enough to hold steady when the mind generates its most convincing reasons not to continue. Naming the pattern is not the same as solving it, but it is the necessary first step. Because a pattern you cannot see clearly cannot be changed deliberately, and what has been invisible is now, perhaps for the first time, in full view. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with effort. It is the exhaustion of carrying a gap, the space between who you believe yourself to be and what your circumstances actually reflect. Most people who struggle financially are not struggling because they are irresponsible. They are struggling while being responsible, which is a much lonelier and more disorienting place to be. The account exists. The intention has always been genuine, and to anyone looking in from the outside, a friend, a colleague, a financial advisor reviewing your profile, you appear to be doing the right things. The optics are intact. The story holds together. But internally, quietly, something else has been accumulating. It is the distance, not dramatic distance, not the kind that announces itself as crisis or failure, just a slow, widening space between who you believe you are in relation to money and what the numbers, examined honestly, actually confirm. That distance does not stay neutral. It does not simply exist as a neutral gap waiting to be closed. It exerts a quiet pressure on everything financial that comes after it. Decisions that should feel straightforward begin to carry more weight than they deserve. Contributions that should feel automatic begin to require a kind of internal negotiation. And the negotiation itself, the recurring need to reconvince yourself of something you already intellectually understand, slowly depletes the confidence that sound financial behavior requires as its foundation. This is the emotional consequence that rarely appears in conversations about investing. Not loss, not error, not a single decision that can be identified and reversed. It is the steady erosion of financial self-trust, the kind that builds when your behavior and your self-image are in consistent alignment, and quietly diminishes when they are not. The person who has been inconsistent with contributions does not only pay a mathematical price, they pay a psychological one. And the psychological price, because it is invisible on any statement, often goes unacknowledged while doing some of its most consequential damage. There is a man worth thinking about here. He lived for 7 years on land beside a river, good land, well-positioned, with real potential for cultivation. Early on, he began the work of building an irrigation channel from the river to his fields. He got most of the way there, but the last 100 yards kept getting interrupted. There was always something more pressing, more immediate, more urgent than finishing the final stretch. A season would pass, then another. The channel remained incomplete, the water remained in the river, and the fields remained dry, not from drought, not from poor soil, not from any external condition working against him, from proximity without completion, from being close enough to the source that the problem never felt critical, while being far enough from the finish that the work never quite got done. That story has no villain. There is no moment of laziness to point to, no single failure of character that explains the outcome. There is only the quiet accumulation of reasonable delays, each one individually justifiable, each one temporarily logical, that together produced an outcome that was neither reasonable nor logical in its totality. 7 years of reasonable interruptions, 7 years of dry fields, and somewhere in the 7th year, the awareness that the distance between where he was and where the water was had never really been about distance at all. Perhaps you recognize something of that story in your own financial life. Not the drama of it, there is no drama, but the texture. The sense of being near enough to the process to feel like you are engaged with it, while something in the final execution keeps getting deferred. The contribution that will resume next month. The strategy that will be properly committed to once things settle. The account that will finally be taken seriously when life becomes a little less complicated. And life, as it tends to do, remains complicated. The months pass. The number on the statement ages in place. And the future that was supposed to be getting closer has been, with quiet consistency, staying exactly as far away as it always was. What begins to form beneath all of this, beneath the checking and the wondering, beneath the low frustration and the recurring resolve that doesn't quite sustain itself, is a recognition that is different in quality from anything that has come before it. Not the recognition of a mistake, not the recognition of ignorance, but the recognition that the relationship itself needs to change, that the way this process has been held, loosely, conditionally, with one foot always ready to pause, is not a relationship that compounding can work inside of, and that a different way of being inside this process is not simply available as an option, but has become, in the truest sense of the word, necessary. That necessity is not a burden. It is, if received correctly, the beginning of something. Because necessity, real necessity, the kind that comes from seeing clearly rather than from fear, has a way of quietly ending the negotiation. And it is only when the negotiation ends that the building can truly begin. Something shifts when you stop asking the wrong question. And for most of the financial journey described in this audiobook, the question being asked, consciously or not, has been a version of the same one. What is this worth right now? It is a reasonable question. It is the question that financial media is built around, that portfolio apps are designed to answer, that market commentary exists to address in real time, every hour of every trading day. But it is, in the context of long-term wealth building, almost entirely the wrong question. Not because the current value of something is irrelevant, but because orienting every decision around the snapshot, the number as it exists today, produces a relationship with investing that is fundamentally incompatible with how compounding actually works. The more useful question, the one that changes the architecture of every financial decision that follows it, is this: what is this becoming? That shift from snapshot to trajectory, from present value to directional movement across years, is not a small adjustment in perspective. It is a complete reorientation. It changes what information feels important. It changes what counts as a reason to act and what counts as noise. It changes the emotional weight of a down month, a flat quarter, a period of unremarkable returns. When you are oriented toward the snapshot, these things feel like verdicts. When you are oriented toward the trajectory, they are simply conditions, weather along a route. not evidence that the destination has moved. This reorientation begins with understanding something that most financial conversations state but rarely fully examine. Compounding is not primarily a feature of markets. The mathematics of compound growth belong to markets, yes, but the experience of compound growth, the actual accumulation that shows up in a life, in a net worth, in a financial future that looks meaningfully different from the present, belongs to behavior, specifically to behavior sustained across time without the consistent interruption that reactive investing produces. No account, however intelligently constructed, can compound what is never consistently added to it. The mechanism is present. The market is open. But the material, the regular unconditional contribution that feeds the process, has to be supplied by a person who has decided in advance that conditions will not determine whether they return. This is the distinction between reaction and structure, and it is where most financial lives are either quietly built or quietly stalled. Reaction is a posture toward investing that treats current conditions as the primary input. When things look favorable, engagement increases. When things look uncertain, engagement retreats. It feels like wisdom. It feels like adaptability. But it is, in the mathematical reality of compounding, a form of chronic interruption. Structure, by contrast, is a posture that treats the process itself as the primary commitment. Conditions are noted, understood, and then set aside, because the decision to continue was made at a level deeper than any particular month's market behavior can reach. Consider a ship navigator sailing before the age of GPS, crossing open water on a months-long passage. She does not steer by what she sees at this moment, the wave height, the wind direction, the color of the sky at dusk. She steers by a fixed star, a calculated heading, a destination that is too far away to be visible and too important to be abandoned every time the weather shifts. The waves are real. The storms are real. The periods of flat, disorienting calm are real. But none of them change the heading. She makes small corrections, absorbs the conditions, and continues. And what looks from the outside like patience is, from the inside, something more precise than that. It is the practiced discipline of someone who has decided, at a level that does not require daily renegotiation, that the destination is more real than the weather. That is the internal posture that long-term compounding requires. Not the forced calm of someone suppressing their anxiety about market conditions, but the genuine steadiness of someone who has reframed what those conditions actually mean. When you understand, truly understand, not just intellectually, but in the way that changes behavior, that fluctuation is condition and not conclusion, that a down month is weather and not verdict, the impulse to intervene loses much of its authority. It doesn't disappear entirely, but it no longer carries the weight of urgency. And without urgency, reactive decisions become much less likely. Something shifts when you stop asking the wrong question. And for most of the financial journey described in this audiobook, the question being asked, consciously or not, has been a version of the same one. What is this worth right now? It is a reasonable question. It is the question that financial media is built around, that portfolio apps are designed to answer, that market commentary exists to address in real time, every hour of every trading day. But it is, in the context of long-term wealth building, almost entirely the wrong question. Not because the current value of something is irrelevant, but because orienting every decision around the snapshot The number as it exists today produces a relationship with investing that is fundamentally incompatible with how compounding actually works. The more useful question, the one that changes the architecture of every financial decision that follows it, is this: what is this becoming? That shift from snapshot to trajectory, from present value to directional movement across years, is not a small adjustment in perspective. It is a complete reorientation. It changes what information feels important. It changes what counts as a reason to act and what counts as noise. It changes the emotional weight of a down month, a flat quarter, a period of unremarkable returns. When you are oriented toward the snapshot, these things feel like verdicts. When you are oriented toward the trajectory, they are simply conditions, weather along a route, not evidence that the destination has moved. This reorientation begins with understanding something that most financial conversations state but rarely fully examine. Compounding is not primarily a feature of markets. The mathematics of compound growth belong to markets, yes, but the experience of compound growth, the actual accumulation that shows up in a life, in a net worth, in a financial future that looks meaningfully different from the present, belongs to behavior. Specifically, to behavior sustained across time without the consistent interruption that reactive investing produces. No account, however intelligently constructed, can compound what is never consistently added to it. The mechanism is present, the market is open, but the material, the regular, unconditional contribution that feeds the process, has to be supplied by a person who has decided in advance that conditions will not determine whether they return. This is the distinction between reaction and structure, and it is where most financial lives are either quietly built or quietly stalled. Reaction is a posture toward investing that treats current conditions as the primary input. When things look favorable, engagement increases. When things look uncertain, engagement retreats. It feels like wisdom. It feels like adaptability. But it is, in the mathematical reality of compounding, a form of chronic interruption. Structure, by contrast, is a posture that treats the process itself as the primary commitment. Conditions are noted, understood, and then set aside, because the decision to continue was made at a level deeper than any particular month's market behavior can reach. Consider a ship navigator sailing before the age of GPS, crossing open water on a months-long passage. She does not steer by what she sees at this moment: the wave height, the wind direction, the color of the sky at dusk. She steers by a fixed star, a calculated heading, a destination that is too far away to be visible and too important to be abandoned every time the weather shifts. The waves are real. The storms are real. The periods of flat, disorienting calm are real, but none of them change the heading. She makes small corrections, absorbs the conditions, and continues. And what looks from the outside like patience is, from the inside, something more precise than that. It is the practiced discipline of someone who has decided, at a level that does not require daily renegotiation, that the destination is more real than the weather. That is the internal posture that long-term compounding requires. Not the forced calm of someone suppressing their anxiety about market conditions, but the genuine steadiness of someone who has reframed what those conditions actually mean. When you understand, truly understand, not just intellectually, but in the way that changes behavior, that fluctuation is condition and not conclusion. That a down month is weather and not verdict. The impulse to intervene loses much of its authority. It doesn't disappear entirely, but it no longer carries the weight of urgency. And without urgency, reactive decisions become much less likely. The change that matters most in this entire journey does not begin in a spreadsheet. It does not begin with a new strategy, a better allocation, or a more disciplined budget. It begins with something quieter and more fundamental than any of those things. It begins with a shift in how you describe yourself, not to others, but to yourself, in the private and largely unconscious way that identity shapes behavior before behavior ever reaches the level of conscious decision. There is an enormous difference between someone who has an investment account and someone who is inside a long-term process. On the surface, these two people may look identical. They hold the same accounts, access the same markets, and carry roughly the same level of financial awareness. But under pressure, during a market decline, during a month of financial stress, during a period when investing feels abstract and the present feels urgent, these two people make entirely different decisions. Not because one has more discipline than the other in the conventional sense, but because they are operating from different internal premises about what they are actually doing. One is maintaining a product. The other is inhabiting a practice. And the distance between those two experiences over a decade is the distance between a number that aged in place and a number that became something worth having. This is the internal shift, and it is worth understanding clearly what it is and what it is not. It is not a sudden awakening. It is not the result of reading the right book or hearing the right argument at the right moment and feeling everything click into place. It is a gradual reclassification, a slow settling of a new self-understanding into the places where financial decisions actually get made. The investor who once pulled back during downturns because the falling felt permanent and exit felt like intelligence begins over time to recognize that falling is a recurring feature of the route, not an anomaly, not a warning, a condition like rain on a long journey that was always going to appear and was never a reason to turn back. What this shift feels like from the inside is not dramatic. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about it. It does not feel like a transformation. It feels like a reduction in friction. Think of the difference between deciding each morning whether to exercise and having already decided, so that the only remaining question on any given morning is practical rather than philosophical. The person who has already decided does not negotiate with themselves at 6 a.m. about whether today is a good day for it. The decision was made at a level that daily conditions cannot reach, and so the daily conditions lose their power to derail it. The internal shift in investing works the same way. Once the commitment exists at the level of identity rather than intention, the market's daily behavior stops being a referendum on whether to continue. The evidence of this shift appears in small and ordinary moments that carry more meaning than they appear to. A contribution made on a flat, uninspiring Tuesday, a month when the market is doing nothing particularly interesting, when there is no narrative of recovery to feel part of, when the number in the account looks the same as it did last month and the month before, and the quiet satisfaction that follows. Not because the number moved, but because you returned, because the act of returning, independent of outcome, has become the thing that feels right. That satisfaction is not small. It is the signal that identity has genuinely shifted, that the process is no longer something you are managing from the outside, but something you are inside of, and the inside feels like where you belong. Discipline, understood from this new position, stops looking like what it looked like before. The old version of discipline was a kind of controlled resistance, the white-knuckled effort of someone doing the right thing despite every instinct pointing elsewhere. That version is exhausting because it requires a continuous expenditure of willpower against a continuous current of doubt. But the discipline that emerges from an identity shift is structurally different. It is not resistance. It is alignment. It is the natural behavior of a person who has genuinely updated what they believe the process requires of them, and what it requires they have decided is their consistent return, not their constant approval of conditions. From that ground, something important changes in the texture of financial life overall. Decisions become less exhausting, not because the market becomes less volatile or the future becomes less uncertain, but because the internal argument about whether to stay has already been resolved. And a resolved argument requires no ongoing energy. The question of whether this month's contribution is warranted, whether the timing is right, whether conditions justify continuation, that question no longer reopens every time the news changes. It was answered at a deeper level, and from that deeper level, the behavior that builds wealth over time becomes not an act of heroic discipline, but simply an expression of who you now understand yourself to be. That is the shift, quiet, earned, and, once it takes hold, remarkably durable. Something interesting happens once the internal shift takes hold. The financial landscape doesn't change. The markets remain what they are. The uncertainty remains constant. The noise continues at exactly the same volume it always has. But the way ordinary decisions land changes considerably. Things that once felt trivial begin to carry their actual weight. Things that once felt important begin to reveal themselves as elaborate distractions. And the entire hierarchy of what matters in a financial life quietly rearranges itself around a new center of gravity. Consider the monthly contribution. Not a large strategic move, not a portfolio rebalancing, not a response to a compelling market opportunity, just the automatic, unremarkable transfer of money into the investment account on the same date every month, regardless of what the headlines are saying, regardless of whether the market is up or down or sideways, and apparently going nowhere. Under the old perception, this act barely registered as meaningful. It was maintenance, not management. Background noise in a financial life that was mostly focused on the more interesting questions of allocation, timing, and strategy. But under the new awareness, this ordinary act is revealed as the most structurally significant thing available to a long-term investor. Not because of what it does in any single month, but because of what it does across every month. Because of what it signals to the process and what the process does with that signal quietly over years. There is also a reinterpretation of silence that becomes possible now. There were months, perhaps many of them, when the portfolio seemed to sit still. No dramatic gains, no alarming losses, just a number that looked roughly the same as it did before. The old perception read that silence as stagnation, as evidence that something wasn't working, that a different approach might be warranted, that the strategy needed revisiting. But silence, in a well-structured, consistently fed investment process, is rarely stagnation. It is almost always the sound of compounding doing exactly what it was designed to do, accumulating in increments too small to feel significant in any individual moment, building with a patience that human psychology was not naturally designed to appreciate. The silence was never the problem. The interpretation of it was. This reframing has a direct consequence for the habit of frequent monitoring. Checking the portfolio often, daily, sometimes multiple times daily during periods of volatility, once felt like engagement, like the responsible behavior of someone who takes their financial life seriously. It produced a sense of control, or at least the sensation of control, which in uncertain environments feels almost indistinguishable from the real thing. But frequent monitoring, seen clearly now, is the reintroduction of noise into a process that requires quiet to function at its best. Every check-in is an invitation for the reactive mind to find a reason to intervene. Every portfolio update is a small test of whether the identity shift has truly taken hold, or whether the old pattern of conditions-based decision-making is still running just beneath the surface. The illusion of perfect timing deserves a final examination here, because it is perhaps the most persistent and most expensive belief in personal finance. The idea that returns can be meaningfully improved by entering at the right moment, exiting before the decline, and re-entering when clarity returns. This idea has survived decades of evidence suggesting it rarely works in practice, not because investors aren't intelligent enough to attempt it, but because the conditions required for it to work consistently simply don't exist in the form the belief assumes. Timing is a strategy for people who are reacting to markets. Building is a practice for people who have decided that their relationship with the process is not conditional on what the market is doing this month. These are not the same activity. They do not produce the same outcomes. And the person who has genuinely shifted their identity understands, without needing to be reminded, which one they are now engaged in. Practical clarity from this position does not present itself as a new system or a refined set of rules. It looks like a reduction. Fewer decisions made from anxiety dressed as analysis. Fewer interruptions justified by intelligence that was really just discomfort seeking an exit. More quiet, unremarkable consistency, the kind that produces nothing interesting to report in any given month and something remarkable to observe across any given decade. Warren Buffett captured something essential in his observation that the stock market is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient. Patience, in this context, is not a personality trait. It is a structural outcome of having resolved the internal argument early enough that impatience no longer gets a vote. This is not a call for passivity or indifference. It is a recognition, hard-won and precise, that the most sophisticated financial behavior available to a long-term investor is the protection of the process from the investor's own most sophisticated impulses. That the intelligence which once generated compelling reasons to pause is now being directed towards something more valuable, holding the course, returning consistently, and allowing the silence to do its work. The complexity was never in the markets. It was always in the mind. And now, increasingly, the mind is no longer the obstacle. Return for a moment to the beginning. Not to revisit it, but to see it differently. The way you might return to a place you knew years ago and find that it hasn't changed, but you have. And so everything about it looks slightly altered in a way that is difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. There was a person who opened an account, who made the first deposit, felt the machinery engage, and experienced something genuine and reasonable Relief, the sense that the future had been addressed, that the architecture was in place, that the long arc of financial security had been set in motion by a deliberate and meaningful act. That person was not naive. They were not irresponsible. They were doing exactly what they understood the process to require, and the understanding they had was the most common understanding available, that beginning was the most important step, and that beginning had been taken. What they could not yet see was the distinction between designing a structure and inhabiting one, between the single act of setup and the sustained practice of return. The architecture metaphor is worth staying with here, because architecture is one of the few things in ordinary life that makes the distinction visceral. A foundation, however perfectly poured, does not become a home by existing. Every subsequent layer requires its own labor, its own time, its own return to the site with materials and intention. The person who pours the foundation and walks away has done something real and necessary, but they have not built anything yet. They have only created the conditions under which building becomes possible. That is where the journey that began in the opening of this audiobook was always quietly headed, not toward a condemnation of the person who stopped too early, but toward a clarification of what the process actually requires and why the gap between what was done and what was needed was never a character failing. It was a missing piece of understanding. One that is now, having traveled this far, no longer missing. The philosophy, the emotional weight, and the behavioral clarity developed across these chapters have been moving toward a single, coherent shape. And the shape is this. Compounding is not a market phenomenon that happens to patient people. It is a behavioral phenomenon that happens to consistent ones. The market provides the mechanism. Time provides the duration. But the investor provides the material through contributions sustained across conditions, through returns left undisturbed, through the quiet and repeated decision to stay inside a process that does not always feel like it is working and does not need to feel that way in order to be doing exactly what it was designed to do. From this, one elegant and simple truth emerges, perhaps the central truth of this entire audiobook. The account was never the investment. The account is where the results of your behavior are stored. You are the investment. Your consistency is the asset. Your willingness to return in uninspiring months and uncertain seasons and flat, unremarkable quarters is what the process is actually made of. The market does not build wealth. Behavior, sustained across time, builds wealth. And the market, when consistently fed by that behavior, amplifies what the behavior has already begun. Growth of this kind does not arrive with ceremony. That is one of its most disorienting qualities for people who have been conditioned to expect feedback proportional to effort. There is no moment where the account sends a notification saying that something important has happened. The accumulation occurs in the background of ordinary months, ordinary contributions, ordinary returns, ordinary statements that look roughly the same as the previous ones. And then, with a gradualism that seems almost sudden in retrospect, the number is no longer what it was. The curve that compounding always promised begins to reveal itself, and the surprise that follows, the quiet, slightly disbelieving satisfaction of seeing what consistency produced, feels almost unearned, except that it was entirely earned in the months when nothing felt significant, earned in the contributions made without enthusiasm, earned in the decision made again and again without applause to return. This irreversibility is among the most underappreciated features of long-term compounding. Once the process has been consistently fed for long enough, it develops a momentum that becomes genuinely difficult to disrupt. The early years require faith in a result that is not yet visible, but the later years carry the weight of everything that came before them, and that accumulated weight, once it exists, does not require the same ongoing act of belief to sustain it. It sustains itself. As Charlie Munger observed, the first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily. The person who has internalized this is not asking whether this is a good month to invest. They already know the answer, because the question itself has ceased to feel relevant. The journey that began with confusion and quiet frustration ends here, not with a destination, but with a direction. Clear, grounded, and finally, fully aligned. There is a kind of financial anxiety that no portfolio gain ever fully resolves. You may have noticed this yourself, the way a good month produces relief but not peace, the way a strong year improves the numbers without quite settling the underlying unease. That is because the anxiety was never really about the numbers. It was about the relationship with uncertainty, with time, with a process that moves too slowly to provide the constant confirmation that anxious engagement requires. And what this journey has been quietly working toward, more than any specific insight about markets or behavior or compounding, is a change in that relationship. Because when the relationship changes, the anxiety doesn't just decrease, it dissolves. And the dissolution is quieter and more durable than anything a single portfolio gain could produce. Patience is worth re-examining here, because the word has accumulated a meaning that doesn't quite fit what is being described. In most financial conversations, patience means waiting, enduring the passage of time while something you want remains out of reach, tolerating the slow pace of a process that you would accelerate if you could. That version of patience is a form of controlled frustration. It requires ongoing effort to maintain, because what it is really doing is suppressing the impulse to act while the impulse remains alive and present. That is not what the investor who has genuinely shifted their relationship with this process experiences. What they experience is something closer to trust. Trust in a heading that was carefully set. Trust in a process that has been consistently returned to. Trust in a future that is being actively built, not passively awaited. Patience built on trust does not feel like endurance. It feels like steadiness. And steadiness, unlike endurance, does not deplete. Time deserves a similar re-examination. For much of this journey, time has carried the weight of an adversary. The years already spent, the contributions not made, the growth that the mathematics say should have been there by now and isn't. That relationship with time produces a particular flavor of regret that is both unproductive and, once examined honestly, somewhat unfair. Because time was not working against you during those years. Time was simply passing, as it always does, waiting to be used differently. The years that feel lost are not recoverable, but they are also not the point. The point is what time becomes from the position of genuine understanding, and from that position, it becomes the most powerful compounding resource available to any investor. Not because there is suddenly more of it, but because none of it is being wasted on the recurring decision of whether to continue. There is a quality of presence that begins to characterize the investor who has made peace with the process. It is not disengagement. They still check in, still stay informed, still maintain an awareness of what their financial life looks like and where it is headed, but the checking in no longer carries the weight of a verdict. They look at the account without the account looking back at them as a measure of their worth or wisdom. They read the financial news without treating it as a directive. They remain engaged with the future, genuinely, substantively engaged, in a way that feels different from the anxious monitoring that preceded it. The future has become real to them, not as a distant abstraction or a hoped-for outcome, but as something that is actively arriving through the behavior of ordinary days. The maturity that this process ultimately asks for is not the maturity of greater knowledge. Most people who struggle with long-term investing already know enough. The maturity it asks for is something quieter, the maturity of needing less urgency around things that were never urgent, less drama around fluctuations that were always temporary, less constant confirmation that the process is working. Because the trust that replaces that need for confirmation is both more accurate and considerably more restful. This is the financial maturity that rarely gets discussed, because it is difficult to sell and impossible to package. It is earned through experience and reflection, and it produces a kind of steadiness that has very little in common with either excitement or resignation. Things work slowly. That sentence, simple as it is, contains the entire resolution of the anxiety that brought most listeners to this audiobook in the first place. The slow pace is not a malfunction. It is not evidence of a flawed strategy or a missed opportunity or an unfavorable starting position. It is the nature of the process, the way forests grow, the way character develops, the way any system of genuine accumulation operates across the span of a human financial life. The person who has truly absorbed this does not feel cheated by the slowness. They feel, perhaps for the first time in their relationship with money, something that resembles equanimity, not complacency, not indifference, but the quiet, grounded steadiness of someone who understands the pace, has accepted the pace, and is no longer spending energy arguing with it. That steadiness is not the end of the journey. It is what the journey was always trying to produce. There is a particular kind of wisdom that doesn't feel like an arrival. It feels like a clearing, as though something that was always true has finally had enough space around it to be seen without obstruction. That is what this final chapter is. Not a new idea introduced at the end, but the original idea, fully visible at last, stripped of the confusion and noise and misdiagnosis that surrounded it when this journey began. The fundamental truth, stated as plainly as it can be stated, is this: investing is not something you set up. It is something you practice. The distinction sounds simple. In some ways, it is. But it carries within it the resolution of nearly every financial struggle examined across this audiobook: the stagnant accounts, the inconsistent contributions, the reactive exits, the intelligent reasons to pause that accumulated into years of interrupted compounding. All of it traces back to the confusion between a setup and a practice, between an act and a discipline, between something you do once with care and intention and something you return to quietly, unglamorously, without requiring the moment to be particularly meaningful or the conditions to be particularly favorable for as long as the future remains worth building toward. This truth, when expanded beyond investing, reveals itself as a universal principle that operates across every domain where compounding is possible. Wealth compounds through consistent contribution. Health compounds through consistent movement and rest. Knowledge compounds through consistent reading and reflection. Character compounds through consistent choices made in the direction of the person you are trying to become. And in every one of these domains, without exception, the force most capable of undermining the process is not adversity or misfortune or lack of resources. It is intelligence that cannot resist intervening. The mind that generates sophisticated reasons to adjust, pause, reconsider, optimize. The mind that is too capable of argument to ever fully commit to the simplicity that compounding requires. The irony is precise and worth carrying. The very quality that makes a person capable of understanding the process intellectually is often the quality that makes them most likely to interrupt it behaviorally. The insight that lasts, the one that does not fade after the audiobook ends, that does not dissolve back into old habits when the market has a difficult month, is not a strategy. It is not an allocation framework or a contribution schedule or a set of rules for when to stay and when to exit. Those things have their place, but they are not what changes a financial life at its root. What changes a financial life at its root is a shift in the question being asked. Most investors, for most of their financial lives, are asking a version of the same question: what should I invest in? It is a reasonable question. It is the question the entire financial industry is organized around answering. But it is ultimately a question about the vehicle. And the vehicle, as this journey has shown in detail, was never the limiting factor. The question that changes everything downstream is quieter and more personal. Who am I being inside this process? Am I someone who participates conditionally, whose engagement rises and falls with confidence and market conditions and the prevailing emotional weather? Or am I someone who has made a decision at a level deeper than conditions can reach, whose return to the process is not a response to favorable circumstances, but an expression of a settled identity? That question, answered honestly, does not require a specific answer to the investment question at all. It requires an answer about the investor. And the investor, it turns out, was always the variable that mattered most. The account has always been ready. That is perhaps the quietest and most important fact in this entire audiobook. The account was ready the day it was opened. The market has always been open, through uncertainty and volatility and periods of nothing happening and periods of everything happening at once. Time has always been passing, indifferently and without pause, in the direction of a future that is being shaped by present behavior, whether or not that shaping feels significant in any individual moment. None of those things were ever the constraint. The only variable that was ever truly within reach, the only one that has always been available to adjust, to commit to return to, without requiring any external condition to change first, was whether you kept coming back, quietly, steadily, without needing the moment to feel historic, or the contribution to feel transformative, or the conditions to align in a way that finally justifies the return. That is the investment. That returning, ordinary, unglamorous, unconditional, has always been the investment. The account was only ever where the results of that returning were stored. And now that you know the difference, the only question that remains is a simple one. Not what to invest in, not when to start, or whether the timing is right, or how to optimize the allocation. Just this: will you return? The process has been waiting. It has always been waiting, and it is ready when you are. Thank you for staying with this, not just for listening, but for remaining present through the parts that were uncomfortable, through the moments where a pattern was named that you recognized in yourself, where a belief you had held with confidence was gently but honestly examined and found to be incomplete, where the gap between what you thought you were doing and what the process actually requires came into full view. That kind of presence takes something. It is easier and far more common to engage with financial content at the level of information, to collect insights the way one collects tools, without ever sitting still long enough to ask why the tools haven't been used. You did something different. You stayed. And staying, as this entire audiobook has argued in one form or another, is where everything that matters actually happens. Carry forward from this, not a checklist, not a set of rules to follow or metrics to track or habits to install through willpower and scheduled reminders. Carry forward a single reorientation, one that is simple enough to hold in a single sentence and deep enough to quietly reshape every financial decision that follows it. You are not managing an account. You are building something. And the building is not an event or a strategy or a moment of optimal entry. It is a practice of return, consistent, unconditional, patient, in the truest sense of that word. It requires your presence not when conditions are favorable, but especially when they are not. It requires your trust not in the market, which has never promised anything on your timeline, but in the mathematics of sustained behavior across time, which remains one of the few genuinely reliable forces in a financial life. The noise will continue. That is not a warning. It is simply a fact, and one worth accepting fully rather than hoping will eventually resolve itself. The headlines will continue to find new reasons for urgency. The markets will continue to provide new occasions for anxiety or excitement or the impulse to respond. The intelligent part of your mind will continue from time to time to construct compelling arguments for why this particular moment is different, why some adjustment is warranted, why the process should be paused until things become clearer. None of that stops. What changes, what has changed through the course of this journey, is your relationship to all of it. And that relationship, quiet and invisible and entirely internal, is everything. It is the difference between a financial life that compounds and one that merely continues, between an investor who builds across decades and one who perpetually restarts, between the account that ages and the account that grows. You have done the harder work already. The rest is simply return.